the wedding planner for my son called me saying, "Your family has canceled your invitation, but we'll be keeping the $2,000 deposit." Before we go any further, if my story has found you, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to see just how far my words can travel. It was a Tuesday morning when the call came in. I was in my office at Madison Hospitality Group, going over quarterly numbers. My assistant buzzed in softly, "Golden Grace Weddings is on the line." I was curious. We almost never send brides to them. They're our competitors, but sometimes they co-host events at one of our premium venues. I picked up and a woman's voice, smooth and practiced, came through. "Good morning, ma'am. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," she said, sounding politely concerned. "I was told to call you today about the Anderson Parker wedding." I didn't say a word and she went on just as calm. "Before we continue, I was also asked to remind you that the couple wants a refined, respectable atmosphere, and they'd appreciate avoiding anything that might take away from that." I stayed silent. I could hear what she wasn't saying. Some people didn't fit the image and I was one of them. It felt like a cold knife sliding into a warm heart. Then she said it outright with a thin layer of apology. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry, but your son specifically asked me to tell you this so there would be no confusion. He said this day is about elegance and dignity, not guilt and garbage from the past." Elegance, dignity, guilt, garbage. The contrast was clear and I was all the wrong things. My son Ethan, the boy I raised from birth after losing another child at delivery, had branded me a stain on his moment of triumph. In his world, words like that weren't casual. They meant, "You're unwanted, unwelcome, unworthy." I ended the call quietly, leaned back in my chair and looked out over the skyline through my floor-to-ceiling windows. I had helped build some of those towers with my investments. I'd poured my life savings into this city. Its hotels, banquet halls and transportation fleets. All under Madison Hospitality Group, the company I created after my husband's illness forced me into the workforce. I built it piece by piece to secure my son's future. And now, the moment my money had done its work, I was pushed aside. In the glass I saw my reflection, a woman well past 60. No dyed hair, no surgical touch-ups, no hints of luxury. But I could still see the bones of someone who refused to disappear. I had never expected gratitude. I only counted on being there. But that morning, being there wasn't enough. The planner's voice had been wrapped in corporate politeness, but underneath, it carried the contempt of turning private guilt into public shame. Garbage, she'd called me, or at least passed along the word. That word echoed in my chest. I thought about the $200,000 I had pulled from my medical savings and retirement, the same amount I raised by selling my husband's last heirlooms. Ethan said he couldn't bear the shame of not affording the wedding. He cried on the phone, telling me if it fell apart he'd lose everything. I wrote the check quietly without any conditions, without making a speech, never telling the board. I just let the money flow from my private account into the vendors. Even as I looked at the signature lines without my name anywhere, I was the one funding all that elegance. I paid in full. I existed only in the eyes that bothered to see me. And now, after Ethan had thrown me out, I stood there still. I pressed the button on my desk and my assistant came in, asking softly if I needed anything. I told her, calm as ever, "Resume the board meeting." She nodded and closed the door. I turned back to my computer where the projections were waiting. Revenue was climbing. Madison Hospitality Group was cash positive. I dipped my pen in ink, tapped it against the desk, then set it down. Nothing moved inside me. I let the silence fill the room. I let the hum of the city seep in through the glass. I wasn't asking for applause. I wasn't asking for a fight. My silence was my protest. All I could think was that Ethan had built a throne on lies and in the process, decided his own mother was a liability, not an asset. People do that to things they can't control. On the wall behind me hung a framed photo of the first banquet hall I'd bought 20 years ago, back when Ethan was 11. I refused to let him feel poor compared to his classmates. We turned that hall into our flagship venue. And now its marquee read, "Anderson Parker Reception without me." I pictured it in my mind, rows of empty chairs, the floral arrangements I'd approved earlier that morning, the waitstaff wearing uniforms I'd purchased. Every single vendor, every single detail owed a year of planning to me. And yet the guest of honor would not be welcome. That's when I decided I would no longer pay for my own invisibility. Not with my hands and not with my money. I opened an email to Lauren. Short, sharp, and unapologetic. Send them the invoice for cancellation. Process refunds for all guests. I'm keeping the $200,000. Then I hit send. That email wasn't just an instruction, it was a breaking point. I wondered for just a second if Helen Keller ever felt that same stillness when shattering expectations. 3 minutes later, the board meeting continued. Contractors who understood my tone began quietly canceling orders. Templates went out. Refunds queued. A wedding worth $500,000 vanished from the calendar in a single day, and the only person who could have stopped it had chosen not to. I stood and straightened my jacket. No applause. No cheers. Because power is often silent. And I had never needed validation. What I needed was acknowledgement. And when that doesn't come, closing a door quietly can be far more powerful than the warmest embrace. I turned to the window again, staring at the city's indifferent skyline. Those buildings had carried me through decades. Now they would witness this too. I rose to speak to the board. About acquisitions, about the future direction of the company, but not a single word about Ethan. That chapter was over. And yet, in the quiet, I felt something stir. This wasn't about control anymore. It was about reclaiming my own story. Not as a shadow behind my son's spotlight, but as the woman who built the stage and refused to fade. A few hours after canceling the wedding, the office phone rang again. I answered, expecting maybe a vendor, maybe a board member, but it was Ethan. His voice was sharp, cold, unapologetic. I had given him everything. A childhood without hunger, an education without debt, a future he thought was only his. And now that he had taken it all, he still felt entitled to discard me. He didn't even bother with small talk. You just can't help yourself, can you? He said. I let the words hang there like a bridge collapsing under its own weight. I waited, hearing the faint clicks of the line against the static. Then Ethan spoke, slow and deliberate, every phrase like another blow. This is exactly why I didn't want you there, Mom. You drain the joy from every room you walk into. His voice was a weapon that day, and he swung it again. Trash doesn't belong at the table just because it once bought the meal. I didn't interrupt. I just hung up, letting the sound of the disconnect underline the finality of his words. 8 years earlier, I had prepared the agreement. 20% of Madison Hospitality Group, the company I built from the ground up, as his wedding gift. $30 million worth of shares, signed and notarized. No one knew, not the board, not my banker, not even my other children. I always believed a mother's greatest gift is to do what must be done quietly without fanfare. The contract had sat in a drawer all those years, untouched but ready. A promise made before love was ever questioned. That promise died the moment he called me trash. The paper curled in my hand as I tore it, piece by piece, folding the edges until the ink cracked and the paper bent. No speech, no ceremony. The goodbye was in the shredding. Then came a soft knock at the door, gentle, not urgent. It was Grace, my daughter, the one born the same night Ethan was told his birth mother had died, and he was placed in my arms by mistake. 5 years ago she found me. It hadn't been dramatic. She came with a brass hospital ID bracelet from her birth records, wrapped in tissue, held like evidence from another lifetime. She was 21, curious, holding a picture of the bracelet and a name that didn't feel like her own. She walked into my office alone. I didn't run. I had already forgiven her absence. She said simply, I came because I know you're my mother. No other words were needed. Today she stepped in wearing jeans, holding a small bouquet of daisies, 2 for every year since she first saw my face in a photograph. I knew she was here because of Ethan. She had politely asked for an invitation, hoping for family reconciliation, not trouble. I just wanted to wish him well, she said softly. She sat in the chair behind me, silent and still. She didn't ask for news or details. She was simply there, a quiet witness. Then the speakerphone rang again. Ethan, as if the line had never gone dead. His words circled like a vulture. Mom, you think money makes up for God's silence, but you were never a mother to me. You've been unwelcome for a long time. You signed your place in my life away years ago. I didn't answer. In his voice I could hear every sacrifice I had made. My hand clenched into a fist, knuckles white against the polished mahogany. Grace leaned in, her whisper carrying both love and disbelief. He doesn't get to speak for you, Mom. Let me be your voice. I didn't stop her. Later, I found out she stepped into view of the security camera, picked up the call on my line and said steady and sure, "You have no right to speak for me." Then she pressed the button to hang up. That single act, two daughters standing together against one man's cruelty, did more than any amount of tears or threats ever could. Then Grace asked softly, "Can he really say that about you?" I turned to her, holding out the torn fragments in my hand, the edges curled from folding. 20%, I said. Signed 6 years ago. But promises only mean something if the people making them keep them. I expected silence. Instead, she looked at me with a kind of pride I had never seen in her eyes before. She took the pieces gently and slipped them into her pocket. "Thank you for trusting me," she said. She picked up her bouquet of daisies which she'd dropped in shock earlier and held them out to me. "Open them if you want," she said. And for once, instead of feeling the ache of a lost child, I took the flowers with a steady hand. The office was quiet except for the low hum of work happening somewhere beyond the walls. Our space, once full of contracts and signatures, felt empty without celebration. But full with understanding. I walked to the window and she came to stand beside me. She didn't cry. She just rested her shoulder against mine. I felt the pulse of the city beneath us, the same skyline I had stared at when the planner first called. In that moment I understood the price of being uninvited, the cost of being truly seen, and the worth of finally stepping out of invisibility. My heart didn't break again, it grew. Ethan had thrown every insult he could think of, convinced they would shatter me. He was wrong. His invitations no longer mattered. The table he had built without me now had no seat for him. As for Grace and me, we would move forward quietly but without shame. My debts were paid. My dignity was back where it belonged. From my desk drawer I pulled out an envelope with her name written in my handwriting. I handed it to her without a word. She opened it and read the note inside. "I love you and I choose you." She touched her lips, then looked up at me. We didn't need to say anything more. We sat in silence until my assistant knocked, unaware of the rupture, and the repair, that had just happened inside this office. I told her to take the rest of the day off. "I'll handle things from here," I said. Grace and I walked out together, our steps in sync. Two women who would never again let the word garbage echo while their foundations stayed unshakable. I closed my office door and dialed Lauren on her direct line. My voice was calm, deliberate. "Cancel the wedding. The venue, the flowers, the hotel, the catering, the transportation. Everything." I didn't raise my tone. I didn't need to. There was a pause on the other end before she said, trembling, "But ma'am, you're not the bride or groom." I waited. I let those words hang. Then I asked evenly, "And who owns Golden Grace Weddings?" There was a pause. She stammered, cleared her throat. I continued, "Owned by Madison Event Holdings, correct?" I didn't give her time to respond before asking again, "And who owns Madison Event Holdings?" The silence stretched. Then uncertainly she answered, "Madison Hospitality Group?" "Yes," I said. "And I'm Ethan's mother. I'm also the sole owner and CEO of that group." Another pause. The air seemed to still. Finally she whispered, I had no idea." I didn't say thank you. I didn't comment on the tremor in her voice. I just said, "Send cancellation notices to every vendor. Issue refunds for accommodations and services. Forward the invoice to the Anderson Parker family, minus the $200,000 deposit. They'll keep that as the cancellation fee." I ended the call without another word. No name-calling, no promises of revenge. It was clean. Professional. I closed my eyes for a moment, took a steady breath, and returned to the board meeting I'd interrupted earlier without explaining why. Silently, the order moved through the company. My executive assistant coordinated with Golden Grace Weddings. My finance team began batching refunds. My legal counsel sent formal notices to the hotel, the florist, the transportation company, every entity under the Madison Hospitality Group umbrella. Vendors were told protocols had changed. Effectively, the contract was nullified by the sole payer of record. I watched the operations unwind like a chain of falling dominoes. Rehearsal dinner cancelled, limousine reservations dropped, catering halls freed up, floral installations stopped mid-delivery. The entire wedding structure collapsed under the weight of a single sentence. "It's no longer proceeding." I stayed seated, hands folded. I didn't cry. I didn't gloat. I let the silence measure itself. Power doesn't need applause. In the glass, I saw my reflection. A woman who had built everything quietly. My decision wasn't a scream. It was a line they couldn't cross. Later that afternoon, the CFO came in and said quietly, "Yes, ma'am. Our systems reflect the cancellation. Refunds are processing. All client payments have been returned to guests' accounts. The $200,000 deposit remains in your trust fund." I nodded once. That was all. I didn't correct him or offer more explanation. I already knew. I called my assistant back. She confirmed that the planners, vendors, hotel liaison, and security had all received notice. "Thank them for their discretion and let them get back to work," I said. She nodded and left. I remembered the day I'd signed the papers granting Ethan 20% ownership of Madison Hospitality Group as his wedding gift. That document had been drawn up with pride, then locked away in a vault. I'd never spoken about it publicly. Now I felt no regret for tearing it into pieces. That contract had fed his entitlement and I saw no reason to keep it. He would never have understood its meaning. He would have only used it. The oak desk beneath my hands had seen my confidence, my generosity, my heartbreak. I stood and looked around the room. The framed model of the first grand hall I purchased, the plaque marking 10 years of expansion, photos from gala openings, my portrait in the lobby foyer. None of it needed defending with words. Their existence proved my worth. I didn't need to underwrite absence anymore. There were no knocks for applause, no staff asking for a statement. The power of that call was in its precision, and its finality. A chair that had been mine at the rehearsal dinner now sat empty. I could picture the guests turning to look, noticing the absence of elegance without dignity. That room would not recover. By nightfall, the planners would be calling other venues, desperate to rebook. They'd find nothing open. The logistics unraveled and it was far too late to recover. The Anderson Parkers would face hard choices or a week of stress they weren't prepared for. That was not my crisis to witness. It was a world I chose to step away from. I turned back to my spreadsheet. The forecasts looked strong. Growth in new territories, hotel rebranding, acquisitions of small chains across 3 states. My legacy was never about a single wedding or a single son. I'd built a hospitality network that was quiet, resilient, and shaped by knowing exactly what it costs when you choose silence over spectacle. Silence is not absence. Silence is presence on your own terms. That night, I left the office under the soft glow of streetlights and headed to my small apartment in Brooklyn Heights. My keys gave a gentle chime as I opened the door. My old cactus still stood by the window, decades strong. I poured a cup of tea and sat beside it. Beyond the glass, the city hummed, unaware of whose empire had just whispered a command that shifted an entire day. I opened a letter from today, an envelope addressed to me. Inside was the cancellation invoice, neatly itemized, and a short note from Lauren. "Your instructions were clear, ma'am. Everything has been sent. I'm sorry it had to end this way." I placed it next to my husband's framed wedding photo. There was no regret, only resolution. In the morning I would write a memo to my daughter, my real daughter, telling her not to worry about trusts or contracts. Later that day she would come with a bouquet of daisies and ask for nothing more than to stand beside me. I would hand her the torn fragments of the contract with her brother's name on it, asking her to place them in my desk drawer. She would forgive me, not for breaking a promise but for finally recognizing which promises can't be kept. I drank the last of my tea and stood. The shadows stretched across my vintage rug as the city lights began to twinkle. Behind me the door closed softly and with it a chapter of service ended. What remained was authority reclaimed, dignity restored, and the quiet knowledge that my power was not loud, but unshakable. The exposure needed no spectacle. It unfolded in absence. Screens showed empty rows and unpaid hall fees. One caterer posted, 2 days' notice. No meal. The Madison CO had pulled the plug. Videos from the event hall appeared almost immediately. Empty chairs, a silent stage draped in unused linens, untouched floral arrangements, guests murmuring in confusion. Drivers contracted to ferry bridesmaids stood outside the lobby in tuxedos, unsure if they should wait or leave. Hudson View banqueting staff posted anonymously in a planning group. Something big went down. The bride's entire vendor chain just canceled. Meals, entertainment, everything. My company's name never appeared. Didn't have to. The truth moved without a press release. Leaked invoices surfaced. A florist confirmed it. You know the reason. Madison CEO pulled the plug. Entire contract gone. A catering manager from the rehearsal dinner venue posted, "We got the 48-hour cancellation notice from inside Madison. They said they own all the vendors and won't risk tarnishing their brand." The local paper ran a dry headline. Golden Grace weddings called off suddenly, company owner alleged. One painfully accurate line in the article read, "Sources say the architect of the cancellation was the mother of the groom, also CEO of the Hospitality Corporation underwriting this and 5 other similar weddings annually." Nobody quoted me. Nobody tagged me. The exposure was mechanical, not theatrical. The next morning, I flipped through trade newsletters filled with pages on liability issues and corporate transparency in wedding contracts. A law professor had posted an opinion piece. When the payer is also the provider, litigation becomes moot. Madison's case sets a precedent in risk management. On social media, event industry professionals debated under posts titled things like "Who really holds the power in a wedding plan?" Comments praised the restraint of the unnamed mother and noted how refreshing it was to see justice without tears or outrage. It was a corporate decision, not an emotional one, one post read, liked by hundreds. There were no trending hashtags, no viral kitchen table drama. Justice was delivered through transactions and terms. Guests who had been refunded left comments on shared boards. "You can't serve food if you don't exist." That day never happened. Meanwhile, the Madison Hospitality Forum's internal newsletter listed the full vendor roster that had been withdrawn, along with the reimbursements issued. That email went to every manager in the company. No one leaked it to the press. They understood that authenticity doesn't always live in the spotlight. Sometimes it wears the armor of integrity. The cancellation became a case study in boardrooms. How to respond when an insider behaves like a client, and what happens when the same corporation owns both the stage and the seats. Within hours, multiple vendors, bridal suppliers, photography studios, transport companies, floral services, sent letters through HR confirming they had been paid in full for their termination fees, citing executive instructions. One letter read, "It is with reluctance we cancel your services," but the instructions were corporate-wide and signed off by the CEO. The numbers told the story. Every penny documented, every refund checked off. Refunds for 220 hotel reservations, 80 chairs, 8 floral installations, catering orders, rehearsal dinner, bar setup. All cancelled, logged, reconciled. That evening, the local gossip newsletter ran a short note. Wedding called off in Madison-operated venue. Mother of the groom implicated as decision-maker. Then it vanished. No follow-ups, no clickbait. The reporters moved on. But at community events near our properties, small weddings, corporate dinners, vendors whispered quietly, "She did it." She walked away when she could. That night, in my small apartment in Brooklyn Heights, I opened the day's mail. A thank you note from a couple who had been disappointed but refunded. They appreciated the prompt return of their deposit and the apology for the inconvenience. There was a stack of other letters. Some from strangers who had seen leaked images of the empty hall and felt justice had been served. None asked me to sign anything. None asked me to speak into a camera. Justice doesn't need charm when it has authority on its side. Later, lying in bed, I listened to the traffic outside, feeling both empty and complete. The cancellation had unfolded exactly as I intended. Quietly, systematically, with purpose and without spectacle. My power was not performance. My voice had been heard by the only people who mattered. I closed my eyes. The next chapter, if there was one, would live outside of savings and contracts. I felt no triumph. Only the unshakable truth that I had stepped out of the category of guilt or garbage without begging for a pardon. The company kept moving. Subscribers tracked the 5-figure refunds. Vendors reset their schedules. Guests planned alternate dinners. But no one, not one person, tried to reclaim that wedding date. And that was the point. I drifted toward sleep, my chest light, thinking only this. A wedding unbuilt by the people who built it is the closest thing to a lie exposed in a boardroom. And the truth doesn't need applause, it needs certainty. I heard from Ethan only hours after the ripple of cancellations reached vendors and guests. My phone lit up with his message. "You've humiliated us. You killed my wedding." I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my desk drawer and took out a small photo from my own wedding day. My husband and I 30 years ago, standing beneath a willow tree on a quiet afternoon. I slid Ethan's message into a plastic sleeve, sealed it so the words would never fade, and placed it beside that old photo inside the box I keep under my desk. My wedding ring, the one I had sold years ago to help fund his event, was there too. I didn't cry. I didn't feel vindicated. I simply nodded to myself, understanding that words can wound far deeper than absence. Later that day, I received an email marked urgent, personal from my daughter Grace. My birth daughter, the one I'd found after 20 years. She wanted to meet. 3 hours later, we sat in a private dining room at Bayview Resort, the flagship property I'd acquired 7 years ago. The room overlooked the harbor, warm with polished oak and neutral tones, but empty of celebration. When I entered and closed the door, I saw them, Ethan sitting stiffly, his knuckles white. My ex-husband and the woman who had become Ethan's wife, both standing, tears already in her eyes. Grace sat beside me, calm, hands folded like a prayer. Ethan's wife spoke first. "We're sorry, all of us. I believed him about you and I never asked. I should have." My ex-husband's voice trembled. "I apologize for every time I let pride blind me. I didn't see you, only what our son wanted to believe." Ethan finally spoke haltingly. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting a vision of success. But I protected nothing. I hurt you." He paused, looking straight at me. "Why didn't you ever tell us who you were?" I met his eyes without anger. I had to decide what honesty sounded like in that moment. "Because if you loved me," I said, "you would have invited me without knowing. You didn't need confirmation. You needed love and presence." Silence followed. Grace's hand slipped into mine and squeezed. Ethan wiped his face with a handkerchief. "You had 20% of that company signed in your name. I know it now. I never asked. I watched you fade while I chased shadows." My ex-husband leaned forward. "We should have looked past tradition to the values you taught us." His wife nodded, eyes red. "I saw the contracts on your desk once," she admitted. "I thought they were for someone else. I regret that every day." There was no performance in my response. No speeches, no grand gestures. I acknowledged their words and held their gaze. Then I stood. "There's nothing more to forgive," I said quietly. "But you looked away when shadows seemed brighter than substance. You chose flash over foundation." I placed the framed message, "You killed my wedding," in the center of the table. They stared at it, the weight of their regret settling between us. Then I turned to Grace. "You may grow this company however you wish. Your brother's seat is vacant. It's yours now." She swallowed and nodded. I looked back at all of them. "We'll walk the rest of the way together," I said, "but truth is non-negotiable." I left before they could respond. That evening I went back to my apartment, unpacked the plastic sleeve and placed it in the same box as the photograph in the ring. Those words belonged there too. I sat on the terrace with a cup of tea beside my cactus. No fanfare. No declarations. Just silence and the finality it carried. In the morning we would talk about business restructuring. But that night I didn't care about stock values or annual reports. I cared only that they had looked at me, truly looked, for the first time. I closed the lid of the box and held it close. The echoes of their apology lingered. Not as absolution, but as the faintest seed of change, planted in acknowledgement, not denial. Grace sat beside me at the long oak table in my office, sunlight pouring across her face through the tall windows. She hadn't asked for anything, not gratitude, not recognition. But she came when others turned their backs. She stood with me when my name was erased from the guest list, not to defend me, but because truth simply belonged to her. I slid a folder across the table. She glanced at the Madison Group seal on the cover, then up at me. "What's this?" she asked quietly. Her voice was steady, like mine had been 30 years ago when I first founded the company. I nodded toward the papers inside. "It's a transfer of 20% ownership," I said. "Voting shares, decision rights, and a seat at the table." She opened the folder slowly, her hands trembling, not from greed or surprise but from something deeper. "This isn't because you defended me," I said. "It's because you never asked me to prove who I was. You never needed credentials before offering your hand." She swallowed, closed the folder with care and whispered, "Thank you." I reached across the table and touched her hand. You are my daughter, not just by blood. You're mine because you saw me when the world saw nothing. She didn't cry. Neither did I. But the room held something no board meeting or financial review ever could. Permanence. Weeks passed. Plans took shape. Grace's wedding was quiet, graceful, and free from the spectacle her adoptive brother once demanded. She chose Bay Harbor, the same venue Ethan once imagined as the crown jewel of his success. Now it stood for restoration, not vanity. She invited me to walk her down the aisle. I declined gently. This is your day, I told her. Not a stage for reparation. Instead, I arrived early wearing navy instead of black with a single white lily pinned to my chest. I sat 3 rows back, not in the family's front row but in a place where the view was soft and honest. The ceremony was in the Westview garden, bathed in golden morning light. Grace walked down the aisle with her head high, her steps steady. The man at her side was gentle and quiet, exactly what I had hoped for her. No one announced who paid for the flowers or the music. No one whispered about ownership or history. It was a wedding of presence, not pretense. During the vows, Grace turned toward the guests. There is someone here who taught me that love is not about being loud, she said. It is about being constant. She is not in the front row, but she has always stood beside me. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time in my life I felt completely seen. After the ceremony, guests mingled under linen canopies. I stayed off to the side. No cameras followed me. No speeches mentioned me. Grace moved through the crowd, laughing, radiant, and paused beside me just for a moment. She took my hand in both of hers. I'm so glad you came, Grace said. I never considered not coming, I replied. She nodded. Neither did I. As the evening faded into music and toasts, I slipped away quietly. No one noticed, and I preferred it that way. I walked alone through the lobby of the hotel I owned, past the chandelier I had chosen 15 years ago, down the corridor where I had once debated every detail of the wallpaper's texture and light. I reached the elevator and pressed the button with the calm that comes only when you have nothing left to prove. In my room, I took off my heels and sat by the window. The city lights blinked in the distance, a rhythm I've long understood. I thought of Ethan, of what might have been, of what was said and lost. Then I thought of Grace. The daughter returned, her name no longer whispered but spoken with pride. That night I wrote a letter. Not to send. Not to frame. Just to keep. Dear Grace. You reminded me that truth doesn't need a stage and dignity lives in the quietest gestures. You never asked me to prove I mattered. You simply made space for me to matter. This company will one day be yours. Not because you are my blood but because you carry the values that built every brick of it. That is legacy. Not capital but character. I placed the letter in the box with the photo, the wedding ring, Ethan's sealed message, and the transfer papers signed that morning. The box felt heavier now, not with grief but with clarity. Ethan never called again. No apology, no second chance. After the wedding collapsed and his name began circulating in boardrooms and industry lists as the son who spit on the hands that fed him, he simply disappeared. Maybe that's how you survive shame, by vanishing into silence and letting pride become your prison. In my family records, he became only a legal notation in an old adoption file. Status: closed. To the world, a footnote. To me, a stranger I once raised. I did not grieve him. You can't grieve what someone chose to bury, and Ethan had buried me long before that wedding. What he didn't realize was that I was the root, not the weed. The following month, Grace stood at the head of the boardroom table. She hadn't inherited the seat, I had placed it in her hands. She read every file, asked every question, walked our properties not to impress, but to understand. She hadn't been groomed for the role, but she was born for it. When the time came, I stepped back, not down, just back. Not into obscurity but into intention. That fall I withdrew $5 million, not from Madison Group's accounts, but from my own, and quietly created something I'd dreamed of for decades. The Silent Seat Foundation. It's a scholarship fund for mothers erased by arrogance, betrayal, and families who discarded them when they were no longer convenient. It offers education, housing, and legal support to women whose love had been invisible until their absence was felt too late. At the launch ceremony, Grace stood beside me in a simple navy suit. She didn't need the title president on her chest. She let her actions speak. The press was minimal by design. No confetti, no influencers, just a podium, a seal, and a room full of women who had been told they were too much, too old, or too irrelevant. She began her speech holding my hand. My mother never raised her voice, she said, but the world finally heard her. Silence followed, the kind born of reverence, not emptiness. There are mothers, she continued, who sat in hospital rooms alone, who paid for graduations but were cropped out of the photos, who built legacies but were labeled liabilities. This foundation exists because their love deserves more than memory. It deserves structure, security, and a future. My mother built an empire not out of ambition but out of absence. Every room she was excluded from, she built a better one. And now those rooms are open to others. I didn't cry, but my fingers tightened slightly on the back of my chair. Not out of pain, but because the weight of being seen is heavy when you've carried yourself alone for so long. That night, after the guests had gone and the lights dimmed, Grace and I walked the corridors of the first hotel I'd ever bought. I told her how I'd slept in the back office during renovations, fixed leaks during conferences, and once stood in the banquet hall after a broken engagement, whispering, "This will matter one day." She linked her arm through mine. "It matters now," she said. Outside, the streetlights blinked like quiet applause. No reporters waited. No family came running with last-minute forgiveness. Just a mother and daughter walking through the empire they built. Not from bitterness, but from truth. Somewhere, I imagine Ethan still tells himself a version of the story where he was wronged. That's his right. But this legacy is mine. And now it belongs to the right hands. If you've ever been cropped out of the family photo, if you've ever been told not to ruin a wedding with your presence, this story is for you. And if my story stayed with you, tap that like button and subscribe. It lets me know you're here and it helps this story reach the people who might need it most.